Yes. Last week we sent out our email newsletter. If you don't get that, it is free. You can sign up for it on our main website. But we've got a few interesting things uh, that came up. We just keep a watching brief on the science news to see what's been reported out there to the general public, and we like to help people discern what we've already been talking about with these footprints. What is the actual evidence, and what is the interpretation of the evidence that is being presented? Um, and it's important to be able to separate those two things, just like it's important what is the evidence with these footprints and what's the story that's being told about them. Interesting, we do all sorts of things in our newsletter, so you will see a great variety of things, whether it's biology, geology, uh, human history, all sorts of things. Um, so this was one story we found about a unique DNA repair protein that was found in a particular microbe which you may not have heard of, called Deinococcus radiodurans. And that name literally means tough, powerful, round bacterium. That's the coccus that resists radiation. And it is quite an extraordinary bacterium because it can tolerate amounts of radiation thousands of times more than what humans can. So much so, one article described it as Conan the bacterium. And if there was ever a nuclear war, if any of those terrorist regimes decided to get stuck into one another, well, Deinococcus radiodurans will inherit the earth along with a few cockroaches. Well, actually, we don't need to worry about that because the end of the world is solely in charge of our God and Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. But anyway, back to Deinococcus radiodurans. It's a common bacterium found in the environment. It doesn't seem to cause disease. It's actually quite friendly, likes to hang out in groups. But its distinctive feature is that it does resist high doses of radiation. And so it has been studied extensively in terms of, well, how does this thing protect its DNA? Because if we could find out that, we could perhaps find ways of protecting our DNA. Now, it does have some what are called robust antioxidant systems. In other words, it is able to protect its DNA from being damaged by chemicals that are just the result of part of normal metabolic processes that happen in all cells. But the other interesting thing is that it has this amazingly efficient way of repairing DNA if it does get damaged. And that was the subject of this study. That's the name of the paper that was put out. DDRC is the shorthand word name for this protein that they looked at. A unique DNA repair factor from D radiodurans. It senses and stabilizes DNA breaks through novel lesion recognition. Now, lesion just means damaged area, a lesion recognition mechanism. So what this thing does, it's a damage repair protein. It scans along the DNA strands looking for breaks. And if it finds one, it sort of snaps shut around the break, and that stops the break from doing further damage, from spreading along the DNA strand. And then it signals for the repair crew to come and fix it. It doesn't fix the DNA itself. It's the front line, as it were, to go out and find any damage and then call in the repair crew. And as the Phys, which is a science news site, its article commented that all cells do have DNA surveillance and repair process. We have them, all living cells have them. But there is a limited number of breaks that can be repaired with most DNA repair processes. But this particularly unique protein helps cells to repair hundreds of broken DNA fragments back into a coherent genome. So that's why it's important to study this and see if we can work out how it does this and perhaps apply it to genetic diseases. But that is also a reminder that, as they said, all cells do have surveillance and repair processes for their genome. That's going on all the time in all of your own cells. And the other interesting thing, of course, is that our cells are constantly dividing, and whenever DNA is copied, it is checked and edited during that processes. And all of these processes involve many proteins working together. As we often say at creation research, nothing in biology works on its own. So this is yet more evidence that DNA is not made for evolution. It's not made to be changed. DNA is designed for after their kind. So do have a look at that article and you'll find more details and specific references there. One of the other articles we recently looked at was about a study of the human heart. And we find these interesting headlines that go back to our point of what's the actual evidence, what are the beliefs and stories that are being promoted. So this was the headline of an article on a website called The Conversation, which has all sorts of interesting things, not just science, but politics and sociology and economics and other things. But anyway, they had science articles. What the unique shape of the human heart tells us about our evolution. Well, what's the story that they're trying to tell? They did a study of the structure and function of ape hearts. That's in living apes using an ultrasound method. If any of you have ever had an ultrasound scan of your heart, it's that sort of thing. So it's a non-invasive process where you can study a functioning active heart. And so they looked at the structure of ape hearts in baboons, gorillas, and chimpanzees, and compared those with the same structure and function of a human heart. Now, just a little reminder of the basic mammal heart structure, and our heart is that same basic structure where you have 4 chambers. They all work the same. And so you have input chambers at the top, which are the brown smooth chambers there, and then the output chambers, which are thick muscular chambers that actually push the blood out. And in particular, they were studying the left ventricle, so the main output pump that sends the blood out to your body organs. And the flow of blood is that it comes in from the top there, past this valve which shuts when the chamber contracts, and then the blood is projected out through a great big artery at the top of the heart. So there's that constant one-way flow like that, and it's controlled by valves to keep it one way. But you have this very, very thick muscular wall. Now notice that the wall is not smooth. It has a whole lot of ridges on it. Now those are bundles of muscles and rejoiced in the name of trabeculae. And so what they were doing with this study was to have a close look at the pattern and the number of those trabeculae, those ridges, and see how they change when the heart is actually moving. And you can actually, with specialized ultrasound scan, see the movement of these muscle bundles, as well as study the internal surface and the internal shape of the heart. So what you're looking at here is if you've taken a cross section through this region, through the left ventricle there, towards the apex of the heart. So you've got orangutan gorilla, bonobo, which is a type of chimpanzee, rainforest chimpanzee, common chimpanzee, and then the human heart. Now notice that the human heart has a much more smooth sort of inner surface compared with all of these other ones. And what they found was that in the human heart, it wasn't just sort of squeezing in with the chamber getting smaller. You could actually see the action of the muscle bundles, and you had a sort of twisting and wringing action, which was particularly efficient for the blood flow. And so This was their conclusion, written by one of the scientists. We believe the human heart evolved away from the trabeculated structure, right? That's ridge structure seen in other great apes. Now, notice they assume that human beings are just another great ape, right? Seen in other great apes to enhance its ability to twist and contract more efficiently. Uh, and they then went on to say, our research challenges the assumption that heart structure is uniform across mammals. Instead, subtle but crucial differences in heart anatomy and function have emerged, right, in response to unique environmental challenges. So there is their story. They have found that the human heart is different to ape hearts. And so they've come up with this story. And we are entitled to ask questions um, of what their observations are compared with what their story is. Now, here are their actual observations. They did find that ape and human hearts were different, and they found that the human heart works well to meet the needs of the body. Now, the needs of the body that they're particularly interested in is that we have a very large brain, which needs a lot of blood flow through it because it's very, very metabolically active, and we walk in an upright fashion that other apes do not walk. Now, some apes can walk upright for a short distance, but normally when they walk, their brain and their body are more or less in line because they do walk on four limbs. So the standard evolutionary story, of course, is that human beings are simply the great ape that got up and walked, or the ape that stood up. And so we need to ask questions politely, but we do need to ask, all right, how are environmental changes going to change the structure of an ape heart? What's going to happen? Right, that's what they believe. Our belief about the origin of the heart is a belief. We weren't there when the human heart was created. However, our belief is based on evidence that the human heart works well. Therefore, it is a very logical belief to say that human hearts are designed by the Creator who made the entire body. So we can walk long distances. The standard evolutionary story is that being able to walk long distances evolved from what they call persistence hunting, when apes decided they didn't want to sit round in trees, but they wanted to go down on the ground and chase after prey. Well, they had to learn to walk or run long distances. Human beings can do that, uh, but our hearts are designed by a creator who made the whole body. Again, nothing in biology works in isolation. The human heart serves its purpose because we can walk long distances and we have a big brain which is directly above our heart when we are walking long distances. So do have a look at that. And then finally, we always like to see if we can find some interesting little design stories. And this one was about bumblebees doing a bit of head banging, which I believe is a sort of disco dance technique where you rapidly shake your head to try and stir up your brain. And it sounds awful to me, but anyway, it is called head banging, and it was referred to in one of the articles we we looked at. So it's all about vibrations, and to do with a type of plant called buzz-pollinated flowers. Now, these are flowers that have their pollen concealed in sort of long tubular structures in the anthers, the pollen-bearing structure inside a flower. And in buzz pollinated flowers, you can actually shake out the pollen by rapid vibrations, and the pollen is be released. And you can actually do that. You can fake this by using a tuning fork to release the pollen from one of these flowers, but the pollen just doesn't blow away. It's concealed in these long tubes, and the anthers need to be rapidly shaken. And so that's what bumblebees are very good at this. Honeybees don't do it, but bumblebees do this. But it's not just the sound of the bumblebee approaching through flapping its wings. the bees actually land on the flowers, and the buzzing noise comes from contraction of the what are called the indirect flight muscles. That's flight muscles in their thorax. And because they have this really clever hinge mechanism in their thorax, the muscles can be decoupled from the wings so that the muscles can vibrate, make that noise without actually flapping the wings. It's really, really clever. And we've known about this for a while. But the other interesting observation is that they do actually hold onto the anthers with their legs, and some bees actually grip the anthers with their mandibles or their jaws. And so some scientists decided they'd study this in a little bit more detail. And this is what they found when the bees grab the anthers with their mandibles or their jaws. They're also shaking their head at a mind-numbingly fast rate, accelerating several hundred times faster than accelerating due to gravity. So the buzz actually comes from rapidly shaking their heads as well as their thorax. And when they do this, they actually get better vibrations by using their jaws to grasp the anthers, and that means more vibrations and more pollen is released. And one of the scientists said, well, we're still learning about pollination. We've been studying it for hundreds of years. It's amazing what we keep on learning. But it does bring up some questions that, again, we can carefully and politely ask the evolutionists. After all, answering questions by asking questions is a technique that Jesus himself used. You then have to go on and answer your own questions, but we are entitled to ask, well, how did the bees develop the muscle and the nervous system control in order to do this and to get the right vibrations? Because as I said, honeybees don't do this, but other species of bees do, including some of the little native bees in Australia. Why did the plants develop tubular anthers, and how did they do that? But most importantly, how did they both develop these things together within one generation? Because you've got to get it right straight away. A better solution for these observations is that God created fully formed plants with their fully formed functional pollinators, right, within 2 days of one another. If you go back and read Genesis 1 and the 6 days of creation. So those are some items in our newsletter. We do actually store them all in our fact files, so you can search for them as individual items. You don't need to know when the newsletter was sent out. We also have a couple of new questions on our Ask site. That's our question and answer site called Ask John Mackay. One was about post-flood Australian animals. Someone wrote in and asked, well, how did Australian animals walk to Noah's Ark? And then how did they get back again? We have a previous question on this. And in particular, they asked about penguins. I'm not quite sure why they picked on penguins, but we do have penguins in Australia, all along particularly the southern coast, but up along the east and west coasts as well. And this was a comment made by the person who wrote in with this question. A penguin, for example, could not survive in hot climates. The same would go for animals adapted to hot climates passing through areas with cold climates. So what they were saying is, how can we account for all the animals that got off Noah's Ark and had to go back to where they came from? So we do have to ask a couple of questions in response. Did Australia actually exist before Noah's flood? And where do penguins live now? I'll leave you to think about where Australia existed before Noah's flood. But where do penguins live now? Well, in fact, they live all over the world, south of the equator. So some of them live quite close to the equator. So it's quite possible for penguins to migrate through some fairly warm places. And some of them still live in fairly warm places like the Galapagos Islands. And along the Australian coastlines and South African and South American. And another new question we got was about Darwin, asking, can you supply me with references and links to Darwin being racist? Now, that's a hot topic at the moment. And this questioner asked, and do we have any comments about Aboriginals being the most primitive of all humans? Now, you probably don't realise this. Um, Darwin did visit Australia in 1836 as part of the voyage of the Beagle, and he did see some Aboriginals, and he made a few comments about them. Uh, he referred to them as savages, and so this is what he wrote in his diary. It is very curious thus to see in the midst of civilized people a set of harmless savages wandering around without knowing where they shall sleep at night and gaining their livelihood by hunting in the woods. He then went on to describe them meeting some Aboriginals, and they persuaded the Aborigines to throw spears for them. And some of them were able to speak English, so they had a bit of a chat with them. And Darwin writes, in their own arts, they are admirable. They will not, however, cultivate the ground or build houses or remain stationary or even take the trouble of tending a flock of sheep when given to them. On the whole, they appear to me to stand a few degrees higher in the scale of civilization than the Fuegans. Well, who are the Fuegans? In fact, they were the people that he saw in Tierra del Fuego, which is at the bottom tip of South America. And he described them as living in fairly squalid conditions. And after he came back from his trip around the world, Darwin did actually donate to a South American missionary society, not so much because he wanted the gospel to be spread. He didn't, he was not a Christian, but he thought that missionaries had a civilizing effect on people. So again, there's that division in his mind between civilization and savages. He was reflecting in 1836 just the general views of what 19th century English people did. But by the time we got to writing The Descent of Man, which is his other famous book, right, his evolutionary worldview was thoroughly embedded in his mind. His whole idea that there's this great organic chain, great chain of being between man and the lower animals, but there has to be a physical connection there. The fossil record does not show that, nor does the living world, and so Darwin is trying to explain these gaps in both the fossil record and the living world away. And so he says the great break in the organic chain between man and his nearest allies, which cannot be bridged by any extinct or living species, he writes in very florid language, so he then goes off on a little diversion and then comes back to his conclusion. These breaks depend merely on the number of related forms which have become extinct. So the gaps are simply the result of some things living and dying out, and so what we see are the gaps, or the things that are on either side of that gap left by extinct creatures. And he then goes on and makes this comment. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. Now, we've seen him refer to the Aborigines as the savage races. So in Darwin's future history of the world, the civilized races would exterminate the savage races. Now, this is evolution in action that is quite consistent with his worldview of the struggle for life, survival of the fittest. And so it's really important that Christians understand and we need to abandon any sort of romantic ideas about evolution being some sort of glorious unfolding of life or anything like that. It is a really ugly, nasty process if it did really happen that way. And then he comments that some ape-like creatures, as this particular German professor, will no doubt be exterminated. So the end result of that in Darwin's mind is that the break will then be rendered wider. Okay, so some of the ape-like creatures between human beings and apes will have died out, and more on either side of the gap will be wiped out. So the break will be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope then the Caucasians. Right, so the gap is going to get bigger so that we'll have Caucasians on one side, apes as low as baboons, so baboons on the other side, and in between that, the ones that are in between will be eliminated. Now notice what he puts in between that gap, Australians and gorillas. Um, we do have references and links to all these original writings, which you can look up. So have a look at the fact file and the Ask site, and you will find more details with references and links to all of these stories, the science news stories and the new questions.